What are we doing with the money that we have today? Are we actually using that to make a difference in ending people's homelessness, or are we continuing it by pouring it into things that aren't necessarily working?
All these folks work together to help this system to work better.
Hey, do things differently in America, people. Programming our way out of homelessness is not going to work.
And all of this is part of the synergy that allows you to take roughly the same amount of funding that you had and deploy it in a much more effective way. Chronic homelessness decreased by 70%.
Our systems served our funders and our providers, but they didn't necessarily make it easy for people experiencing homelessness to get out of homelessness. We help people find the internal motivation for what they want to do to make positive changes in their life and then follow through with it. I don't like to drive by someone camping on the roadside, and I spend a huge part of my life trying to make it different. It's not about a political affiliation. This is about...
Welcome to Affordable Houser. We talk to the people who make affordable housing happen. And this is another episode in a continuing series where we're taking a deep dive into the methodologies and the people and the systems that helped Houston achieve a very significant reduction in homelessness between 2011 to 2017. And that's actually been built upon and I think improved since then. But this series is an effort really to go back and document what we did, the team of people involved in this accomplished in that initial time frame. So today we're really lucky to have one of my favorite people here with us, Eva Thibaudeau. She is super cool. Since 1994, doing supportive services and involved in helping people who have experienced homelessness. She's a national expert in this area and has done incredible work in Houston and in other places. She currently serves as the Director of Supportive Housing for NHPF, which is a nonprofit that began back in the 1970s. One of the largest nonprofits that provides affordable housing in the country. They've got approximately 60 apartment communities now. And Eva is their Director of Supportive Housing. She was working for an organization called the Coalition for the Homeless when we were all working on this effort back in 2011-ish. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, very briefly, I want to, and I do this with all our guests, where you live is so integral to who you are and who you become that I think it's important and a good way to get to know the people who are doing good work in this space to hear a little bit about their story. So let's take a few minutes, if we could, please, Eva, and tell us where did you grow up? You know, what home or homes did you grow up in? What was the environment like, and how did that impact you and mold you?
Yeah, I love that question. So I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. It was the big city for all the little unincorporated places around it. To me, though, what was most important is that, I always knew where home was. We always had a house, and people were always welcome at our house. It wasn't that we had tons of money or that we had like the coolest new stuff, but home was always there and everybody was always welcomed into our home and our family. And that's something that I've really taken with me. I was talking to my daughter this morning as I was thinking about this question, because my kids have spent plenty of time in the home where I grew up visiting grandparents, and it's still there. And my daughter was like, Mom, that's what you do for our family. We've had this home, and it's not that times haven't been good or bad, but we've been able to hold on to that home. And the touch point that the home I grew up in is to me, and that my home now is to my children, it really, it brought it full circle for, why do we do this work? It's about creating home and having that stability, because really that's the springboard. When you say that I was, started in homeless services in the 90s, I did. I was right out of high school, early college, and it was having, I guess, that, that core of knowing where you can go home to and where you can be that allows you to give something extra, out into the world.
And how did that influence the home that you've created as a parent? I know you've been involved in fostering numerous children. If you can maybe tell a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I've had the awesome opportunity to be a foster mom, an adoptive mom, a guardian, a safe place for people to land for however long they need it. And
For how many kids?
so I have 7 that I've raised. My youngest is still 16, so he's still in the mix. But and I've had about 85 foster children over the years.
Wow.
And then all of the friends and folks and hangers on that come with having that many kids.
So you have personally provided a home to more people than anybody that I actually know.
Lots of home providing. Lots of cooking, lots of providing home, and lots of making beds, and finding pallets for people to sleep on, having that space for everyone to keep their own personal things, even if you don't have your own personal room, but honoring that place where everybody can come and rejuvenate has been, it's been so important. So yeah, I think. At the end of the day, for me, home is where you can go and you can really be yourself.
Right.
And they have to keep liking. Well, no, they don't have to like you. They have to keep loving you. That's the thing in our house is like the house is always open. This is your home. You're always loved. We don't always like each other, but you're always loved. And that's what home is.
And maybe not everything is always tolerated.
Not everything is tolerated at all. However.
But there is love.
You have a safe place to come home.
Acceptance and forgiveness.
And Mel, you're always forgiven.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, you've done a lot of good for a lot of people, and it's just part of who you are and part of why I'm just so honored to know you and to work with you.
I have to say, though, so when I was doing AmeriCorps and volunteer work, that's what brought me to Houston and got me into foster parenting. What I came to realize then is that almost all of the parents of the children who were in my home were experiencing homeless or housing disruption or housing insecurity. Yeah. And I had this really profound experience in my first job, really in depth in homelessness. I was working for the Coalition for the Homeless, and we were closing down a building that was basically condemned by the city of Houston. And Mayor Parker pointed to the coalition and said, find those people somewhere to go. We're turning off all the utilities in 7 days.
Wow.
And so my intern and I...
Oh, was that one particularly problematic apartment complex?
Across from our partners, the Beacon.
Yeah.
Oh, there was another one too, but this one was downtown on Prairie.
Oh, okay.
And we had 70 people who life had pretty much forgotten, who literally were paying this guy to stay there, and they were living in closets or...
Oh my gosh.
It was horrifying. And we met this one man who literally should have been in hospice and was dying. Full-blown AIDS, not well, but also really severe addiction issues. We were talking about on the 4th or 5th day, and we ended up getting him into hospice. And he was talking about his children, his wife, how important his son and his daughter were to him. And I realized that he was the father of 2 kids that I had had in foster care.
Oh, wow.
Who had a horrific story. And yet I realized that this man in front of me also had his story, and everything just came full circle. And I was like, what if he could have been housed and have been loved and been safe and didn't have to have all that turmoil when he was young?
Right.
How different might it have been? And may I never have even had the opportunity to meet his children, and that would have been wonderful because I didn't meet them in a happy place. So, it really, whether it's, being a parent, being a foster parent, whatever, it kept pushing me in this direction toward, addressing this issue of homelessness. And through our work, Neil, that we've done for many years in this exciting place of Houston, at the end of the day, the first intervention to end homelessness is housing.
So we've talked about this organization called the Coalition for the Homeless a couple of times. Yeah. What is the Coalition for the Homeless? What was its role in the homelessness initiatives in Houston, and what was your role in it?
I worked at the Coalition for the Homeless a couple times in the same position, but with about 3 or 4 years in between. And the coalition was always trying to be a support and a driver of ending and preventing homelessness in the greater Houston area. It was really doing it without any real teeth or guidance. And so by the second time that I went there, we had some evidence-based practices, we had some best practices, and we also had a congressional mandate from the Hearth Act that said, hey, do things differently in America, people. We now know that we cannot, programming our way out of homelessness is not going to work.
What does that mean? What do you mean programming our way out of homelessness?
So the way that we used to do homeless services, and rightly so, is we saw people experiencing homelessness and we gave food. Then we gave food and we said, you need shoes. So we opened clothing closets. Then we said, wow, you have shoes and your belly is full, but you need a job. So let's work on education and employment. And then we said we have education and employment, but we need budgeting and parenting skills and sobriety and mental health care and all of these things. And so we came up with pretty complex and robust programs of services to offer to people. The problem is that when people were in the crisis of experiencing homelessness, they weren't necessarily at a place in their lives where they were ready to take advantage of our wonderful programs.
Right.
And services. And so while we were spending, and I say we as service providers who were compassionate, caring people, we were spending tons of money on these fantastic programs, we still were not moving the dial on ending homelessness for people. And in fact, homelessness was growing in the nation. It was becoming intractable for a lot of people who we came to know, under a definition of something called chronically homeless, but really of people who had multiple disabling conditions, many of them centered around, mental illness that is not treated, and extreme poverty. And so we had these folks who were out there for a long time, and the programs were not meeting them where they were. And so the Hearth Act that was passed in 2009, I believe, and the regs were implemented in 2011, 2012, which is when Houston really, had this huge sea change of how we addressed homelessness,
Right.
Was that we stopped trying to program people out of homelessness. And instead we said, hey, how about you sign a lease and we will wrap all of the services and supports around you that you could possibly need to support you adhering to that lease and keeping your housing. And once you don't want or need us anymore, we're out.
Right.
And now you're housed and stable. And so it was a really, really radically different way of looking at housing. And one of the things is that in a community, you have to have a system that is making sense of all of this for the end user, right?
Well, so let me just interrupt for a moment and say one of my favorite sayings is from Henry David Thoreau, who said that for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, one is striking at the root, right? So I've tried over my career to try to find the root causes of problems instead of hacking at the leaves and the symptoms. So it sounds like what you're saying to me in essence is that we had all these programs to meet needs, hunger, clothing, etc., medical care, whatever, of people who did not have housing, who didn't live in a home, but that wasn't getting to the core of the issue, and so the Housing First movement says, guess what? Instead of trying to just solve people's problems with a bevy of programs, we're going to go to the root and get them the stability of housing. And then we're going to add these programmatic and supportive elements to that to help them succeed and stay successfully housed. And then they have a much higher probability of progressing in their lives, of getting a job, of, depending on their disability or lack thereof or their situation. So that was the big sea change that
100%.
Which is what Housing First is. So sometimes I hear people debating what's the best way to tackle homelessness, and some people say, well, Housing First doesn't work because it's not a perfect solution and there's still issues. Well, yeah, it's not a perfect solution, but what we found is housing is the solution, right? I mean, that is what is needed, and it is what gives people the stability in their lives to be able to progress. So okay, so that's cool. So you were part, and you saw that.
Well, and so
that transformation and progression.
Yeah, and I do. I don't want to I don't want to lose sight of a really critical piece here that I think made it work in the greater Houston area is that there was a strong administrative lead, and that was the coalition.
Okay.
And so
let me clarify too. The Coalition for the Homeless Center is a nonprofit, non-governmental entity that acted as the coordinator of the different nonprofits and for-profits and governmental entities that were all trying to address homelessness.
And funders.
Right? So that was kind of the hub for all to coordinate all of these activities from other parts of the community regarding helping those who'd experienced homelessness. Is that correct?
That's correct. One of the linchpins that the congressional mandate did was it said that within every community across America who takes HUD money to address homelessness, you have to designate someone to lead up the work. Somebody has to put out the memos, take the meeting notes, set the meetings, make sure that all the tasks are done, in between meetings. And so in Houston, that is the Coalition for the Homeless. And it's important to note that the community chose the Coalition for the Homeless. So the providers, asked the coalition to do that. The city and the county entities, our community development and housing departments, our housing authority asked the coalition to do that. And so
and all those groups had members or representatives on the board of directors of the Coalition for the Homeless. So it was this nonprofit organizing entity with people appointed from those groups.
Yes. And what's really key, I think, to actually making a change is that those groups empowered the coalition to make really bold steps to change business as usual.
Okay.
And so I think sometimes that's lost when I talk to counterparts, across the country, is that they may have an entity, whether it's a government office or a nonprofit, that they say is doing the administrative work, but they're not empowered to actually lead and make decisions.
Oh, yeah.
And that's important, or nothing will get done.
Okay. And then there's, for people who are housers, actually many people who are very involved in affordable housing development, finance, et cetera, don't understand this narrow niche of homelessness. And so one of the things that the legislation you referenced did was require that communities have something called a continuum of care, which is still different from the Coalition for the Homelessness. And so why don't you take a crack
I'll give it a
at
try,
explaining what the continuum of care is,
say.
and I'll give you my 2 cents.
So whenever I talk to groups or train, I'm like, does anyone know what the continuum of care is for the homeless response community? People are like, no. And then I'm like, who thinks that they're part of the continuum of care? And no hands go up, maybe 1 or 2. And I'm like, wrong, you're all part of it. As long as homelessness is a symptom of all of these other, societal institutions, we're all part of the continuum of care that ends homelessness. So we have our education institutions and researchers. We have our mental health authorities. We have first responders, our healthcare, and our housers are all part of this continuum of care that prevents and ends homelessness. That's the esoteric, ethereal definition. So, Neil, why don't you go ahead and give us...
Well, so essentially, what HUD did was HUD said, we have a certain amount of money per year that is appropriated for services for people experiencing homelessness, and we're going to disseminate those funds. When I was assistant secretary for HUD and was responsible for that area, the amount was about $2.4 billion and annually, and I think it's about $3 billion annually now. But what HUD said was, HUD knew, and I've talked to the people who created this program and came up with this continuum of care idea, who were brilliant, good people, right? They knew that sometimes cities and counties, for example, don't work very well together, and prior to, say, 2011-ish, there had been a history of Houston and Harris County not playing well together at all.
Very
right?
true.
And so HUD essentially said, guess what? Counties and cities and service providers.
And the VA. Don't forget the Veterans Administration.
And the VA, all you groups that are involved with this, if you want this money that we're going to provide for services, you will work together and you will cooperate or you won't get the money, which was actually pretty brilliant to them. And they said the vehicle for cooperating is you have to tell us what your continuum of care is and have little meetings. Well, I shouldn't say little meetings, but as a lawyer, I often wondered, what is this thing? It is not an actual corporate entity, and we're having meetings and people are voting. And when I was on the Continuum of Care board, I was almost apoplectic as a lawyer because I was like, we don't have articles of incorporation. We're not registered as a legal entity. And yet I'm voting. What is voting?
Just vote, Neil.
Yeah. And so basically I just had to get over it and realize that this was an informal group that HUD says has to come together and has to work cooperatively to receive the funding to provide services.
Well, what I think was really smart too, though, is that so HUD really looked to its community leaders and its policy leaders that were tapped into the work that was going on in communities across the nation, and then devised, legislation and regulations that brought those best practices and learnings to the entire nation and mandated it through funding. It was brilliant.
It was brilliant. And another element of what HUD did that was brilliant is that HUD made the acquiring these funds by local entities competitive. Right? There are some grants from HUD, like the Community Development Block Grant Fund, which is done as an entitlement grant, meaning that there's just a formula, statutory formula that's incredibly complex that nobody can influence even if they want to, that just says we have $5 billion, say, per year for CDBG money, and per the formula, this much is going to L.A., San Antonio, El Paso, New Orleans.
My understanding is they put our census number in, and then it goes into something complex, and we end up with a pot of money.
Right. But it's not based on performance. And I know the folks who ran the Continuum of Care funding, and they intentionally structured that to be a competition. So they also were super smart data geeks, right, who really cared about outcomes and results and were agnostic and just were bipartisan. They didn't care about ideology. They cared about we've got this much money, what is going to be the most efficient use to help the most people who are experiencing homelessness. And they tracked the data and they followed the data, and that is why they did so well.
That was really wise. And it is what has allowed us as homeless response system leaders, of which you were one, to have conversations with our peers in the business world, in the government world, and say, this isn't feel-good stuff. Yeah, it has a great outcome, we hope, right?
Right.
But just from a business perspective, it makes sense. From a money perspective, it's a lot more cost-effective and efficient to just subsidize someone's rent and pay for some people, to give them services, than it is to create some huge program that isn't really meeting our needs.
Exactly. And,
And again, going back to what you said, it rewards people who actually are doing the work and making the changes and following best practices.
Right. And so I'm going to review briefly some of the success that Houston had between January 2011 and 2017. So veterans homelessness during that time period decreased by 99%. Chronic homelessness decreased by 70%. Overall homelessness decreased by 60%. And part of what we realized was happening is that we were spending about $103 million a year between the city and the county to serve 1,500 individuals, chronically homeless individuals who are living on the street, which is almost $69,000 per person annually, which is about $5,700 per month. And when you step back and you look at this and you think about Housing First, you can fund a pretty nice apartment for $5,700 a month, right?
And a whole lot of services.
Right. So no matter how you slice it, it is far less expensive to help those who are chronically homeless living on the streets to get into a modest apartment and then provide services for them. And so what we did was we went through and we looked at all the grant funds that were at our disposal, and we decided to make an investment, we meaning the city, the county, et cetera, of about $102 million. And of that, $62 million was for bricks and sticks, was for new construction of apartments and conversion of existing apartments to what we call permanent supportive housing. About 40 million of that was for homeless services through, I said we're not going to use a lot of acronyms, but there are different funding sources such as housing opportunities for people with AIDS, CDBG funds, emergency solutions grants, HHP, SP rather funding. And so what I was largely responsible for as the Director of Housing and Community Development at the City of Houston was the bricks and sticks, the generation of the housing, which that 62 million was not all federal money. Some of it was from local sources as well. But you were involved heavily in the public services side. And so I want to kind of pivot to that, right?
If I can real quickly comment on that. So I think that there are a couple of things that when I, would meet with colleagues in other regions and other continuums of care, number one, what Houston remembered was that you also need the service dollars.
Right.
Just investing in the housing and even matching it with the rental subsidies is not enough. You'll have really high turnover. You're going to burn out your owners and landlords and everybody and your staff. And it's a setup for your residents, if you don't have supportive services. So number one, Greater Houston really looked at, okay, it's not just, building. Again, we came together as an entire community and paired the services with it.
Right.
And we can jump into services. But the other piece that really was transformational in our community is the way, and I want to shout out, we had a lot of HUD technical assistance that was poured into our community. We were very, very receptive to it and incredibly action-oriented with it, which is why I think we have the results that we have. It was fantastic. But the city, the county, and eventually even our private funders from, we had the group funders together to end homelessness, but other, folks like the Greater Houston Community Foundation all came together and said, look, we don't have new money coming into this equation. What are we doing with the money that we have today? And are we actually using that to make a difference in ending people's homelessness? Or are we continuing it by pouring it into things that aren't necessarily working? And so the city, the county, and a lot of our private funders all took that leap to fund in unison and pull in the same direction, which is a seismic change for a community. Yeah. We did not get 500 or 100 million new dollars to play with.
Right.
And that I think needs to be said because a lot of communities think they can't do anything because they don't have new money.
You learned to use the money that you had much more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that meant having hard conversations with nonprofit groups, for example, who were doing wonderful work serving those who were experiencing homelessness, maybe for decades, and sitting down with them and saying, guess what? You got to change the way you do stuff. You're awesome, but you can be awesomer. And we want you to be awesomest.
From the service perspective, and as the person who is having a lot of those conversations with boards of nonprofits, with CEOs, that was really, really painful. And I want to call out an organization that I worked for, who even before all of this happened, made some decisions like that. They were looking at moving into a new building. They had started as a soup kitchen and eventually, had grown into the whole continuum and doing permanent supportive housing.
Okay.
And as they were looking at moving buildings, they said, what are we really about? Where has this industry led us to, and what should we be doing? Their founder was still alive and very involved, and they all agreed that the new building was not going to have a soup kitchen, and they were not going to continue that. They were going to focus on what really worked, which was that permanent supportive housing and that case management for the most vulnerable. And those are the types of decisions that local nonprofits made. That is very, very, very difficult to do, but they did. And,
and that doesn't mean that they no longer supported somebody feeding those who are experiencing homelessness. So
Other people were
may have
doing
said
it
there's
great.
another nonprofit who's handling this, and we can step back from that.
Absolutely.
And so, but HUD, what they have done over the years is they keep tweaking the point system in the competition and looking deeper and deeper at the data because they get more and more information to see what's most effective, and then they tweak the scoring accordingly so that it forces these changes, whether people want them or not, if they want to receive the funding, which I think is frankly brilliant.
I think so too. It makes sense.
Because it's so hard for institutions to change.
And I want to put out there really honestly, as someone who's led nonprofits, it's not in my best interest, to vote for a change that could jeopardize my model and the funding for it. And
Right.
so it's not fair even to ask our leaders of nonprofits to make those decisions. And so, having that external influence, I think, is a fantastic tool to help people change in ways that, they never would.
And sometimes people think, is the federal government doing anything right? I can tell you from years of study and personal involvement, in the homelessness arena, the federal government is doing fantastic work. HUD is doing fantastic work. Now, one of the things that you were involved with too was mapping out and looking at how individuals accessed services for the homeless. I've got this, this chart which we'll put up, which is mind-blowing, which was not just, we want to show how complicated this looks or confusing. This is actually how the services worked for people who were trying to access them, and it was incredibly confusing. We have another chart that shows how the funding previously filtered down, which was also incredibly complicated and disjointed and problematic. And part of the effort that you were involved in, and I was involved in to some degree too, was something called coordinated access, where you streamline the provision of services for the people who are experiencing homelessness so it's not so complicated for them, and also streamline the funding. And so we can show this other chart that kind of outlines how the funding was organized and streamlined, and the provision of services was streamlined. And all of that coordination got everybody pulling in the same direction. And all of this is part of the synergy that allows you to take roughly the same amount of funding that you had and deploy it in a much more effective way.
Absolutely.
Because you and others, and HUD helped with this with technical assistance, which just means somebody from HUD comes down and helps you understand best practices all over the country and use the best methodologies. All these folks work together to help this system to work better. And that was super cool.
They were system mapping exercises. So we were looking at how did people get funded to manage or end homelessness, and how did people access the services that they need to do that. What became really clear to me was our systems served our funders and our providers, but they didn't necessarily make it easy for people experiencing homelessness to get out of homelessness.
Who the whole system was designed to help.
Right. And we really got this nitty gritty where I would be in weekly for about, I think, 6 months. I spent 4 hours a week with city representative, county representative, coalition, COC, and one other. But we went through all of their requirements for paperwork, for documents that basically whoever they funded. So I'm a nonprofit organization,
right.
And Joe walks in the door. I'm like, Joe, I have funding from 5 different agencies, and each one has 6 different pieces of paper that you have to fill out. Well, that's a huge deterrent to Joe. And it makes it hard it's a barrier to access. And so the systems came together and said, how can we get it down to one piece of paper that satisfies all of us so that Joe doesn't have as many barriers to exiting homelessness? So did it mean more work for the case manager? Maybe. Did it mean more work for, the supervisor at the city or the county? Maybe. But at the end of the day, what we kept saying is that, this is our job. We're paid to be here. That person who's in crisis, they're not getting paid, and they need us to do this work for them because it really is our job. And so that was some incredible, incredible changes that, that came out of recognizing.
Yeah, I don't think you can overstate
Yeah.
how important this kind of exercise is. And part of that was sharing of information of all these different nonprofits, different shelter providers, et cetera, through a computer system, the HMIS, which is what Homeless Management Information System, right? So it was very helpful. I know theoretically, and I'm not sure how far this has gone with coordinated access, if somebody walked into one nonprofit that provided services for people experiencing homelessness, that nonprofit should be able to see not just their resources, but through the system where other resources are, for that individual to help them, right?
Yeah, the concept is that there's no wrong door. If you walked into my agency today and I'm brand new out of school and I want to help you, but I don't know anyone,
right,
you're not going to get housed by me. But if you happen to go over to agency A and you got Sarah, who's been doing this for 40 years and everyone knows her, you're going to get housed, and that's not okay. And so changing the way that you do this is that no matter everybody gets the same door to enter through. The other piece I want to say that was interesting is once we started this coordinated access project, we started asking people, what are your requirements or your eligibility or your restrictions on staying there for a night or being there for 2 months or getting into your program at all.
Right.
And what we found is that there were a ton of really arbitrary restrictions on people coming in. And so, again, it was another look at barriers in our system that we hadn't even expected to see. And we were able then to go back and say, well, why this rule? Would you be willing to not have that? And at the end of the day, we were able to standardize that pretty much across all providers so that there aren't all of these different requirements for entry.
Oh, which is great. So previously, if you were experiencing homelessness and you had to go to a variety of different agencies, nonprofits to access the services, after coordinated access, you should have been able to go to one that's a part of this network and get information about them all, and all of them were supposed to be coordinating. Now, to what degree has that been successful? Are we 70% of the way there, or what's your
So
thought?
I feel like on capturing the permanent housing resource, in the greater Houston area, we're as close as you can be to 100%.
Cool.
But knowing we're not perfect and no one can be, I won't give it that. When it comes to other services, are they as robustly, integrated? Probably not.
And coordinated.
Right. And coordinated, no. But the fact that we got here with housing, which again is the most effective way out of homelessness,
right.
I think is winning. You talk to kind of like the ongoing evolution, of this, because doing it once and getting it right, isn't how this world works. We're constantly learning from our past and feeding in new information as populations change. So, all of that factors in. I would definitely say that the greater Houston area has put in the work and it's maintaining the work. And again, that's where, having a strong lead agency to keep that going, because, I don't know, we've had natural disasters since all of this started.
Yeah.
And so, even in an area without natural disasters, there are other things to take time and attention. And so, to have a system of homeless response that sticks to housing as its outcome and everybody keeps pulling in that direction, even when, elected officials change and, policy priorities change. To have had this groundwork in Houston that we've been able to pull on now for, over a decade and a half is, I think, the reason why we remain as strongly positioned as we are today.
Well, and I personally feel really strongly about how important the democratization of data is to good policy making. Because if you just leave all of the policy making to elected officials without arming them with data to understand how impactful their decisions and the programs that they implement are, you can have a great program that's running, and then you get a new mayor, and it's gone because the new mayor has a different set of priorities and just says, hey, that was his or her program. We're not doing that anymore, even though it might have been great, and so having this kind of continuity, also having that guiding hand from HUD in terms of meeting out the funding every couple of years, right? Instead of doing long-term 20-year commitments and having it competitive helps with all that. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about we use the term permanent supportive housing frequently, and those of us in this world understand that the permanent part of permanent supportive housing is, rather than living in a temporary shelter for a short period of time, you're in an apartment. And if you need some help with rent, there's some kind of rental subsidy, usually through a voucher from a housing authority to help supplement your rent. So you can have permanent housing from that perspective. The housing means the H part is housing as opposed to a shelter. The S part of PSH, or permanent supportive housing, is the supportive services, and that's where you focused. So what kind of supportive services are typically provided and are provided in Houston for people experiencing homelessness?
Sure. So I think the key is that you have a robust and available on-site supportive service team. So sometimes
but what does
it's
that
just
mean?
It's just your case manager. So you might have a social worker. You might have someone who's a peer specialist. So someone who has had lived experience.
Yeah, what's a peer specialist?
So
You're
someone,
explaining it, but I'm still
so
processing.
someone who has lived experience. They've experienced homelessness. They've maybe been in some of these housing programs, and now they've gone through some training. They're at a place in their lives where they're wanting to re-enter the workforce. And so they may act as a peer specialist, which is part of a team that helps to keep people housed. So your supportive service team is case managers, social workers. You might have a community health worker, which is someone who's going to try to connect you to managing blood pressure, to managing your insulin or diabetes, making your doctor's appointments. These are the folks who are on your team who will show up on your doorstep and say, hey, we're here to help you do what you need to do to stay housed.
Okay, and to stay healthy.
And to stay healthy. At the end of the day, though, we want people to stay housed. When we're in our own individual houses.
You don't care about whether they're healthy?
I care if you're healthy. I care if everybody's healthy. However, at the end of the day, I'm not responsible for the health and how you manage your health inside your house. And we shouldn't be putting that expectation on other people just because they're in different circumstances than we are.
Well, and people who live in homes get sick and have illnesses
and make
die,
really unhealthy choices.
And have all kinds of issues with their health. Yeah, so I understand what you're saying. You're not trying to micromanage people's life choices. You're trying to meet them where they are and help them in ways that they're open to.
At the end of the day, all of our conversations stem from managing a lease. You have to maintain your housing, and that means that you can manage the contract that is your lease. So if you have explosive anger issues and you get really, upset and you go banging on people's doors and you're always threatening property management, and then you're like, gosh, I just lost my mind. I'm sorry. I'm not going to say, I really think that you might have a mood disorder and let's go get you assessed by a psychiatrist. What I'm going to say is, hey, there have been a lot of write-ups. There are disruptions to the community on the property, and this is going to impact your lease and your housing. What are your thoughts about that? What can we do? It may lead to, I want to take an anger management class. It may be, you know what? I'm going to put, this sign on the door that says, when I'm losing my cool, do not unlock and leave. That might do it for some people. Whatever it takes to maintain your lease.
Okay. Because housing has been provided for that individual, and you want them to stay there because you know it's the humane thing to do to provide housing, and that person is going to have the greatest possibility of succeeding, whatever their challenges are, with the stability of a home. Of housing.
I think also, when we think about our communities, and I'm a member of my community, you are of yours, all of us are better and healthier when our neighbors aren't living impaired, chronically ill lives, on the streets of our homes in our communities. So, yes, it's great to have people housed. It's about human dignity. It's also healthiest for all of us.
Right. So are there certain guiding principles or practices that help you to succeed in providing services for people who have been homeless? And and who are now housed?
There's certainly some evidence-based practices, some best practices. There's a type of working with people that's called motivational interviewing.
Okay.
And essentially the idea is that if you go into your doctor and your doctor is like, Neil, you have got to start running. I just, that's it. Your heart's going to stop tomorrow. Run 5 miles. I want you. No. I don't care if your feet hurt. Doesn't matter. You don't have shoes. Run. Okay. I'm going to see you back here in a month. Tell me how it's going. Now, inside your head, you're like, I don't have shoes. I don't have time. I don't have an alarm clock. There's nowhere for me to run in my neighborhood. Like, this guy's a nutter, right?
Right.
You just talked yourself out of any positive intervention.
Well, not to mention, I don't want to run 5 miles a day.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Instead of I say, hey, Neil, what are you thinking? There's been this weight fluctuation. Do you have any thoughts on that? And you start talking about, I'm kind of stressed. I feel like I need to do something. I'm not happy with this. And it's like, well, what do you think you might be able to do? It sounds like this is causing some problems in your life. You're like, well, maybe I can park a block further away and walk. And it's like, that's great. Why don't you start? Do you want to start doing that? When do you want to start that? You want to start tomorrow? Well, let's meet in a couple weeks. Let me know if you did that. Do you want me to check in with you or encourage you? Now you've come up with a solution. You've come up with something that you want to do. You're going to be much more likely to do that.
Right.
So that's called motivational interviewing. We help people find the internal motivation for what they want to do to make positive changes in their life and then follow through with it.
Now, often when I talk to people about homelessness, somebody commented on a social media post I did a while ago about helping those who are experiencing homelessness, saying they're all drug addicts. That's a problem. It's all drugs. Or it's all mental health. What's been your experience in terms of how big a factor substance abuse is and mental health in terms of the number of people who are chronically homeless, who are living on the streets?
When we're talking about people who are living and experiencing unsheltered homelessness, they're the most visible.
And what do you mean by unsheltered homelessness?
Unsheltered. They're not in an emergency shelter. They're not in transitional housing. They're literally living out on the streets.
Okay.
And so, that's who we most associate with being homeless. But remember, behind that are, scores of people who are experiencing housing instability, who don't have the name on a lease, who don't know where they're going to go tonight or tomorrow, who are in long-term hotel stays.
Who are sleeping on some friend's couch. We call couch surfing.
Who might stay in the car several, nights a month. And people who are intermittently homelessness, where they're going to hit the homeless response system one time, get something, get a need met, resolve their issue, and we're never going to hear from them again.
Okay.
So a lot of people's perceptions and assumptions around who is homeless and what causes it are are based on what we can see. And just remember, that's highly visible, and that is not characteristic of most people who experience homelessness.
Okay.
Now, of people who are extremely vulnerable on the streets, experiencing long time unsheltered street homelessness, we typically find such a complex variety of issues that are going on. In maybe a quarter, 20% or fewer, serious mental illness or substance use is a factor. But it's typically a factor of a whole lot of other things.
Okay.
They're not typically the driving factor of homelessness, or it's a rare instance where it is. Most of us have family members or the uncle or the cousin or, so-and-so who lives with grandma because they just can't quite make it on their own, right? That's how society is. That's how, tribes work. And that's who we are at the end of the day. It's really for folks who don't have that kind of support. That's who we end up seeing on the streets. And so, yes, there's mental illness that is exacerbated by the crisis of homelessness. Right. Especially untreated depression, is awful. Substance use is absolutely exacerbated by being on the streets. I don't think that most people set out to be sober while experiencing, street homelessness. I
Right.
wouldn't.
Right.
And so, those are factors, but the really big conditions oftentimes are, systemic issues. They have background issues. They don't have employment history. They can't get a job. They've been incarcerated multiple times, and now they're over 40. And so a lot of those youthful impulsive behaviors aren't there anymore, but their past is, so impactful against them in negative ways that they just can't get a toehold.
So they can't get a job.
Can't
People
get a
run
job.
a criminal background check, find out they were a convicted felon,
Yeah.
and then they're out on the street, and things just spiral downhill. Or
Exactly.
so, what kind of successes have you seen in people's lives in this work, and what kinds of challenges or failures, if they're, I'm not sure failures is the right term, but just what are the successes and the challenges looked like?
So through, I think, 3 or 4 different iterations of working in homeless response that I had, I kept coming across the same woman everywhere that I went. She was always there.
Over years.
Over years. Okay, we're going on 24 years now, okay?
Wow.
And she still keeps popping up, and I love her. Year 12, she called me, and her name came up in my phone, and I answered, and I said, Felicia. And she's like, Eva, I have the same phone number. You helped me get stable. And I've had the same phone number this whole time. She had been through phone numbers every month, every few months. She was always like, hey, Miss Eva, it's Felicia. It's my new number.
Yeah.
And for her kids being able to be in contact with her grandkids being able to be in contact with her ability to reach out to me and me have a name pop up and know who it was and answer on the first ring. She was like, I've been able to do this because I've stabilized in housing and I can actually keep up with a $20 cell phone bill.
Wow.
So it's not always like, I bought a house, I have, an individual development account and I'm going back to school. It's like I can be reached by people who love me and by people who I love. That's a huge win.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's been kind of laced throughout the conversation is barriers to entry for being able to obtain services, whether it's staying overnight at a shelter or receiving, food food. Nonprofits typically don't have much barriers to entry. They just feed people. But other service providers, and particularly shelters, sometimes have what we call high barriers to entry. Mm-hmm. And there are some groups that assist people who've experienced homelessness that have like really regimented programs, transitional housing kinds of programs. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was an issue when I was at HUD was that there were the folks that were orchestrating the point system for the funding through the continuum of care found that some of the transitional housing programs that did do a lot of good, but would have like these really high barriers to entry. So they'd say, hey, you got to get sober before you come and participate in our program. And then if you go through some crash sobriety program and you get into our program, it's a year-long program. You're going to live in a barrack-style kind of thing. You're going to live.
Work.
You're going to live like a Marine.
Yes.
You're going to live in this highly regimented situation, and we're going to teach you all these awesome life skills. And many of those organizations do good, and they'll show you anecdotal evidence of really great things that have happened. But one of the things that the data geeks at HUD found out was that a lot of those programs had really high rates of recidivism.
Oh, yeah.
So the people that went through this complex and super intensive program for a year or whatever, a high percentage became homeless again, and they were incredibly expensive. And so one of the things they noticed was that if you can use other methods like rapid rehousing, where say mom or dad loses their job and they get evicted from their apartment or their home and they're homeless, if you can help them get back into housing within 3 to 6 months by helping them with deposit fees and utilities, et cetera, first last month rent, that is a way less expensive than these year-long kind of programs.
Yes.
And the rate of recidivism was way, way lower. So the probability of them continuing to be homeless was way, way lower. So they said, okay, we're going to change the funding and we're going to focus more on rapid rehousing.
Yep.
Well, when I was at HUD, there were political issues where different providers would go to their members of Congress and they would say, hey, we've been doing these really cool intensive programs for years, and all of a sudden HUD is they're not going to fund us. They're discriminating against us. They must just want us to only help people who are drug addicts and have all these problems and whatnot. And I was able to say, well, guess what? We have mountains of data that shows that kind of extremely expensive methodology with poor results overall is just not the best way to use taxpayers' dollars, the scarce resources that we have, and it doesn't do the most good. So having HUD from above saying, you know what, we're looking at the data and we're going to change the scoring, it bums out those who aren't following the data. But it helps.
Well, it was really helpful locally because the reality is that a lot of those, those barriers, those programs, they weren't bad programs. They didn't have the right people in them. If I'm experiencing the crisis of homelessness and all that I want to do is get my kids off the street, I'm going to say yes to anything. And so now you have me who all I wanted to do was get off the street. But now you want me to, accept your 5 pillars of transformation, to graduate. And that's not actually what I bought into. I bought into the bed. And so, if I were running that type of program, I would want the people who really want to be there for a year or two and focus on what you have to give me so that I can get to a different place and increase my self-sufficiency.
Right.
So, there's 100% a place for them. Talking about homelessness, at the end of the day, the problem is that people don't have a place under a roof to sleep. And so that's what HUD has to solve. And after that, it becomes how do we keep people in that house and not back on the streets? And that's the services. And so, we really made this huge shift from wanting to help people self-actualize and become better people.
Right.
To just saying, what are we really trying to get at here, people? It's about the crisis of homelessness.
Right.
Everything else is cake and gravy.
Right. Which solving homelessness requires a home.
Absolutely.
Which means a roof over your head. Permanently, not a shelter.
And then people to help you stay there.
Right. And one perspective I took from being at HUD was that local governments need to do their part as well, right?
Yes.
I mean, the overwhelming majority of the funding for serving those who are experiencing homelessness comes from the federal government. And so I thought it was interesting to have mayors of cities who were really politically on a spectrum where they didn't want anything from the federal government or were constantly critical of the federal government, whichever side of the spectrum they're on, but saying to me, how come you're not doing more? You federal government are not doing more to help my city. It's like, well, cities, I think part of the ongoing solution will be cities and counties actually coming up with funding from their own coffers to supplement federal resources to be able to make things happen. And, we see examples of that. Los Angeles, where they've had such radical struggles with homelessness, they passed $1 billion bond issue a few years back. Now, people think that's just going to be a panacea. Well, it takes a long time to build those new apartments. And so all this work requires intensive effort and focus and compassion and intelligence.
It does.
You gotta use the resources that you have extremely wisely. And people tend to think that government just is terrible at that, but that's not always the case. In this sphere, I think government has been doing really good work.
I think they've been incredibly smart. I also think that, and I say this as a social worker, but I don't think that it helps to get too mired in the heart of things. and
What do you mean by that?
and the touchy-feely stuff of
okay.
homelessness. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a resource issue,
Right.
And we should be treating it like that. And the solutions are not difficult, but it is incredibly difficult work.
And I will tell you, too, I've seen incredible bipartisan cooperation, by and large, in addressing homelessness.
Yeah. Nobody feels good about Americans being unsheltered.
Right.
It's not a good feeling. I don't like to, drive by someone camping on the roadside. And I spend a huge part of my life trying to make it different.
Right.
And so, no, it's not about a political affiliation. This is about making, our communities and our country a better place for all of us to be living.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be a good note on which to conclude, unless you have any parting thoughts.
I do not.
Thank you so much for spending time with me. It's
Absolutely.
always a joy.
Thank you.
You're doing amazing work. I applaud your efforts. You're very humble, but you've done a tremendous amount of good and have made a real difference in so many people's lives. And thank you for that.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this. This is such an important story to tell.
My pleasure.
All right.